a change with training. Potentially, there's a reduction in maximum heart rate with age, but that's implied by the 220 minus your age equation. So somebody who has, like myself, who's 40 years old, 220 minus my age is a 180 beat per minute maximum heart rate, and somebody who's 90 years old is going to have, significantly lower. So maximum heart rate doesn't necessarily change with training, but there seems to be a reduction with age. Figure 11.4 in slide 13 shows that there's a reduction in heart rate for post-training at rest at low intensities and also at higher intensities. And it appears as though at higher intensities there's even a greater reduction of heart rate. So that could be due to an increase in the recruitment of small capillaries and a further decrease in increase in end diastolic volume because of a reduction in diastolic blood pressure. This chapter doesn't talk too much about changes in blood pressure, but maybe we'll get into it. The heart rate stroke volume interaction, the not 100% of the increase in cardiac output is potentially due to a decrease in heart rate, increase in stroke volume. It happens to a particular extent for everybody. It could be the case that some individuals have an increased stroke volume to a particular percentage, and others have a greater or lesser reduction in heart rate. So the interaction between stroke volume and heart rate is varied from individual to individual. With aerobic training, it seems as though that the heart rate recovery is faster, is more effective. And in regards to cardiac output per minute, it seems as though there's not much of an impact during rest, but during maximal exercise, there seems to be an increase in cardiac output, potentially due to the increase in stroke volume. Figure 11.5 shows the difference in heart rate and heart rate recovery for a trained and a pre-trained individual. And you'll notice the blue line starts a little bit higher than the red line. It plateaus at a very similar exercise intensity and time, but then the post-training exercise heart rate is able to get back down to below the resting value, and it occurs at a much faster rate. So there's a greater and more efficient speed of recovery in regards to heart rate for trained individuals. Figure 11.6 shows cardiac output between pre-training and post-training. Shows that post-training there's an increase in cardiac output that remains and allows that individual to get to a greater intensity on the treadmill. So not only is the cardiac output increasing, but because of that, the ability and the sport performance ability is increasing. Other changes to the cardiovascular system because of aerobic training is increased blood flow to the active muscle. That could be because the blood plasma volume increases, which reduces the viscosity of the muscle, but it could also be because there's an increase in capillarization and utilization of small capillaries, which is going to increase the total cross-sectional area for blood flow for oxygen carbon dioxide exchange to occur. There's also going to be a reduction in blood flow from inactive regions, like potentially my organs, so that more oxygen and macronutrients and fuel can get to the active muscles. There's an increase in total blood volume, which prevents any decrease in blood returning to the heart, so that the stroke volume doesn't have negative impacts. Figure 11.2 shows the difference between muscle fiber capillarization in a trained and untrained individuals. Obviously, there's going to be more capillaries pre-exercise training and post-exercise training for a well-trained compared to an untrained individual. Slide 19 discusses blood pressure. Because the heart is going to contract harder, which is in part due to the strength of the muscle and also the thickness of the left ventricular wall. There's more ejection volume. There's going to be potentially more pressure on the arteries and veins. Because of that, during training, systolic blood pressure and during increases of intensity, systolic blood pressure will increase, and that's an indicator of the heart contracting harder and forcing more blood out of it. Diastolic blood pressure is actually potentially going to decrease a little bit, and what that's going to do is it's going to promote a greater negative pressure in the heart, and that's going to allow the heart to act as a better vacuum to suck more blood in. If there's more blood in the heart, then that's going to increase the preload, which is going to potentially increase the stroke volume. So typically with training, systolic, like with acute bouts of training, or over a longer period of time, systolic blood pressure will increase and diastolic blood pressure will decrease. But there's limits to that. If the systolic blood pressure reaches past 250 millimeters of mercury during any exercise test, it's a reason to to terminate the test. And also, if the diastolic blood pressure increases past 10 millimeters of mercury during an exercise test, it's also an abnormal cardiovascular response. So typically, during a bout of exercise that increases gradually with intensity, the systolic blood pressure will increase a little bit, and diastolic blood pressure may stay the same or decrease with a trained individual. Blood volume is going to increase relatively rapidly. Plasma proteins like albumin and other liquids are going to be absorbed into the blood plasma through the interstitial fluid. That's going to increase the actual volume of the blood, so that there's less of a reduction in venous return. There's an increase in red blood cell volume, and although there's an increase in red blood cell volume, there's a greater increase in plasma volume. So it could be the case that the hematocrit, which is a percentage of your red blood cells to the total blood plasma volume, may decrease with highly trained individuals. It's called athlete-induced anemia, and that's something that we want to just consider. It could be the case that the athlete is not anemic, it's just that they're trained and their hematocrit values appear low, but they're actually not necessarily um, at a level that might cause dysfunction. That increase in blood volume, we've said, is going to reduce plasma viscosity and allow blood to course through the veins and vessels with a little bit less friction, or a little bit less resistance. So figure 11.7 shows that for post-training, there's an increase in the total blood volume from 5 liters to 5.7 liters, and albeit there's a 0.2 liter increase in red blood cells, the total hematocrit actually reduces. So that's just something to be aware of. In regards to respiratory adaptations to aerobic training, pulmonary ventilation is going to decrease at any submax intensity. There's going to be a greater ability to expand the lungs, and there's going to be a greater tidal volume, and because of that, there's a reduction in potential respiratory frequency. But one of the major adaptations that bipedal animals have compared to quadrupedal animals is the fact that we can change our respiratory frequency and our breath to step ratio, so we can become more effective at utilizing oxygen as the endurance bouts continue and into longer duration. Pulmonary diffusion will usually increase at maximal intensity, and that could potentially have to do with a greater extraction of oxygen from the blood to the tissues, which creates a greater pressure gradient of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And if that's the case, the transition or the diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the utilized muscles will become more effective, and that will positively impact the arterial venous oxygen difference. With aerobic training, fiber type will increase in size. Potentially, there could be an increase in the number of type 1 fiber types. Transitions from type 2 to type 1 muscle fiber types is still being researched. It's been studied on animal populations, but the research to improve external validity on human populations is still is still being looked at. It could be the case that type 2X muscle fiber types, which are really good at power, may perform more like type 2A muscle fiber types with increased aerobic training. There's an increase in the number of capillaries that are utilized, and there's an increase in the actual growth of and the number of capillaries with aerobic training, um, which could increase the arterial ventricular difference in oxygen, which in turn would increase the VO2 max according to the Fick equation. There's also an increase in myoglobin. Myoglobin is the molecule that's going to attach to oxygen once the oxygen gets into the bloodstream. It's the myoglobin that attaches to the oxygen that brings the oxygen to the mitochondria. So there's an increase in myoglobin, and that's going to allow for more oxygen to be brought to the mitochondria and increase the production of ATP. There's going to be increase in the size and the number of mitochondria with aerobic training. We're on slide 23, which is going to increase the oxidative capacity of the muscle and allow for more ATP to be created. There's also going to be an increase in oxidative enzymes like succinate dehydrogenase and citrate synthase, and what that's going to do is allow for more um, utilization of fats and sugars in the bodies. And in fact, with highly trained individuals, there's going to be a switch to the utilization of fat for fuel, and they're going to save, or the body becomes more effective at saving any of the extra, or I mean, the body wants to save blood sugar. So as the athlete becomes more trained, they're going to use the stores of fat, especially if the endurance training is at low intensities, and it's going to save the um, it's going to save the sorry, I just got a phone call. It's going to save any muscle glycogen and liver glycogen for higher intensities. It's called glycogen sparing. With figure 11.8 on slide 24, it shows changes in VO2 max given months of endurance aerobic training. And you'll see that after month 1 and 2, and maybe even month 2 to 3, there's still a relatively significant increase in VO2 max with training, but it appears to plateau off. But slide 25 shows that with training, there is an increase, a continued increase in succinate dehydrogenase activity, which is an oxidative enzyme. And then if you look at slide 11.8c, it shows that with months of training that there's a continued increase in the training distance that this athlete can run. And that training difference more closely mirrors the increase in the succinate dehydrogenase activity than it does increases in VO2 max. So for long-term aerobic endurance training, it appears as though the increase in the oxidative enzyme concentration is potentially more of an impact than the increase in VO2 max, than the increase in actual VO2 max. It shows figure 11.9 shows the actual or the measured values of succinate dehydrogenase in an untrained, a moderately trained, and a highly trained individual, and it appears as though that the intensity of training is also a modulator of both succinate dehydrogenase and citrate synthase, which is going to allow for a greater utilization of oxygen and improved cardiovascular performance. In regards to metabolic adaptations to aerobic training, there are potential changes to the lactate threshold. For an individual who's highly trained, the lactate threshold is going to be delayed, which is an indicator of reduced lactate production, which is an indicator of increased lactate clearance, which occurs because of increased oxygen being brought in. So it allows for greater utilization of the slow glycolysis system, The increase in VO2 is going to allow for oxygen to continue to be utilized in the mitochondria, and um, the delayed onset of lactate accumulation is going to allow for that athlete to continue training into higher intensities. There's also a reduction in the respiratory exchange ratio, especially with maximal intensities, and that's gonna imply that there's less of a utilization of sugars and a greater dependence on fat stores. And again, that goes along with that glycogen sparing terminology. It shows here that blood lactate concentrations, figure 11.10 on slide 29, for a trained individual, the lactate threshold occurs at 80% of VO2 max, where for an untrained individual, it happens more at about 55 to 60% of VO2 max. And that increase in lactate threshold in that graph there is very, very similar um, to the graph that shows a relationship between VO2 max and treadmill speed. So again, the trained individual has an increase in lactate threshold at about 8.5 kilometers per hour, where the individual who's trained is able to get to a higher treadmill speed before the actual lactate threshold occurs. So the lactate threshold is delayed, and that allows for a greater intensity of activity. Resting VO2 max doesn't really change with training, but that's because at rest there's not a need for an increase in VO2 max. There's probably